In early 1944, Carl Jung broke his foot in a fall, an ordinary accident that kept him confined to bed for weeks. While he was still recovering, his heart failed. He was rushed into a hospital in Zurich, given oxygen and injections to keep him alive, and for a period of time no one, including the doctors treating him, could say for certain whether he would survive the night. His nurse later told him that, during the worst of it, she'd seen a faint glow surrounding his body, a soft light she described as unmistakable and strange. The kind of thing, she said quietly, that she'd sometimes noticed before in other patients who were dying, a detail she offered almost reluctantly, unsure how a man of his standing would take it. Jung never once forgot what happened to him during those long hours. He wrote about it later in careful, specific detail in his own memoir, dictated in his final years to a close collaborator, and what he described has been debated, quoted, and reinterpreted by his readers for 80 years since, still discussed today by people who never read another word he wrote. Jung was 68 years old, already one of the most well-known psychiatrists in the world, decades into a career that had made his name recognizable well beyond academic circles, when his body simply stopped cooperating. The broken foot had kept him bedridden and largely inactive for weeks on end, and that prolonged inactivity is generally understood to have contributed to the heart attack that followed, a serious one, severe enough that his doctors weren't confident, in the days immediately after, that he'd pull through it at all. He drifted in and out of consciousness for days, his condition serious enough that his own family was warned more than once by the attending doctors to prepare themselves for the worst possible outcome. At some point during that stretch, unable to say for certain afterward whether he had been dreaming, delirious, or experiencing something else entirely, Jung found himself somewhere his own body clearly was not. If you're new to this channel, this is where we take one real teaching from one real thinker and break down not just the idea but how to actually use it. Subscribe if that's useful to you, because we do this every week. By his own careful written account, Jung felt himself high up in open space, looking down at the planet from what he estimated was roughly 1,000 miles above it, no sensation of a body carrying him there. Simply the fact of being present at that impossible height. He described the Earth bathed in a deep blue light, the ocean a rich, saturated color, unlike anything he'd seen from ground level, the outline of continents visible beneath him, with a clarity he found genuinely difficult to put into ordinary words afterward. Far below he made out Ceylon, and further in the distance the outline of India. He could see the Arabian Peninsula, part of the Mediterranean, and snow catching the light on the peaks of the Himalayas, details he later recorded with the same precision a geographer might use, not the vague, dreamlike impressions people typically report from ordinary dreams. It's worth pausing on the year this happened. 1944 was nearly 2 decades before any human being had actually traveled high enough to see the Earth's curve and continents laid out this way in real life, and long before satellite photography made that view something an ordinary person could casually look up. Jung wasn't describing a memory or a photograph he'd once seen somewhere, and he had no background in aviation, geography, or any field that would have primed him to picture the planet this specific way. He was describing something his own mind produced, in vivid and specific geographic detail from a hospital bed in Switzerland, with no obvious source for that particular image to have come from, a detail later commentators have found genuinely difficult to explain away. As the vision continued, Jung described drifting toward a massive dark block of stone floating in space, something like a meteorite, roughly the size of a large building, hollowed out on the inside. Carved into its surface was the entrance to a temple, lit from within by a soft, steady light, and standing in a small alcove just outside the entrance was a figure Jung described as a Hindu ascetic, seated cross-legged in silent meditation, apparently waiting for him specifically. There was no sense of fear attached to any of this, by his own account, only a kind of quiet, total certainty about what came next. Jung wrote that he understood, without needing to be told, exactly what was waiting for him inside. Everything he had done, everything he had wanted, everything he had ever believed about his own life, was about to be stripped away, piece by piece, as he approached that entrance. A process he described as painful but also strangely necessary, like shedding something that had only ever been temporary, a kind of preparation rather than a punishment, the way a person might set down heavy luggage before walking through a doorway. And once inside, he would finally understand why he had existed at all. A question he described feeling was about to be answered completely and permanently, with a certainty he had never once experienced in nearly 7 decades of ordinary waking life. He never made it inside. Just as he approached the temple, Jung wrote that he became aware of something rising up from Europe, far below him, an image he associated with his own physician, appearing not as an ordinary doctor, but in what he described as a far older, archetypal form, a healer from ancient tradition rather than a modern man in a white coat, a figure connected, in Jung's own reading of the vision, to an ancient Greek tradition of medicine and healing far predating modern hospitals, the kind of symbolic substitution his own theoretical work had spent decades studying in other people's dreams. This figure told him, in the logic of the vision, that Jung needed to return, that his time had not yet come, and that leaving now, this way, would be premature and wrong, a message delivered without explanation simply as fact, in the strange, compressed logic visions tend to carry. Jung's reaction, by his own account, was not relief. He wrote that he felt genuine, sharp disappointment, even frustration at being pulled back from something he experienced as more real and more complete than ordinary waking life had ever felt to him. A reaction that surprised him as much as it might surprise anyone hearing the story secondhand. Coming back to his body and his hospital room was, in Jung's own description, a slow and genuinely painful process, both physically and emotionally, closer to grief than to gratitude for having survived. He wrote that for weeks afterward, he struggled to feel real interest in the everyday details of his own recovery, food, conversation, the normal texture of daily life, all of it feeling flat and thin compared to what he'd briefly experienced, as though ordinary reality had lost some of its color, its usual weight replaced by something closer to background noise. He continued having vivid visions for several nights after the main episode, waking consistently near midnight in what he described as a completely transformed state of mind, unlike any ordinary waking or dreaming state he'd known before, describing moments of what he called a kind of ecstatic, boundless happiness, unlike anything he could easily put into ordinary language, a feeling he later said was nearly impossible to convey fully to anyone who hadn't experienced something similar directly themselves, no matter how carefully he chose his words. Slowly, over the following weeks, the intensity faded, and the ordinary demands of physical recovery gradually took over again. There's one more detail from this period that Jung considered significant enough to record carefully, down to the exact date, decades later, in a memoir otherwise organized loosely around themes rather than a precise chronology. On April 4, 1944, a date he specifically remembered years afterward, precise enough to note in writing decades later without needing to check a calendar, he was finally well enough to sit up on the edge of his hospital bed for the first time since falling ill. That same day, according to his own account, the doctor who had cared for him throughout his illness fell sick himself, developed a fever that wouldn't break, and died of blood poisoning not long afterward, a decline that began, as far as Jung could tell, at almost the exact moment his own recovery finally started, the two men's fates crossing paths in a way that seemed in hindsight almost too precise to be coincidence. Jung had, in fact, been that doctor's last patient before his death. Looking back at his own vision, in which a version of that same doctor had appeared to send him back to life, Jung couldn't shake the sense that something meaningful had passed between them, something that ran in the opposite direction from what anyone would have expected, as though the exchange he'd sensed in his own delirium had somehow anticipated a loss neither of them could have consciously known was coming, a strange coincidence he never once tried to fully explain away, only to record faithfully alongside everything else he'd personally witnessed, leaving the reader entirely free to draw their own conclusions. It's worth being precise here about what Jung did and didn't argue based on this experience, precisely because his own careful language gets flattened so often by people retelling the story secondhand, decades after his death, without access to the full context surrounding his original account. He never claimed it was scientific proof of an afterlife, and he was careful, in his own writing, to acknowledge openly that he couldn't say for certain whether what he'd experienced was a literal glimpse of something beyond death, or an extraordinarily vivid production of a mind under extreme physical stress, oxygen-deprived, and heavily medicated at the time. What he did say, plainly, was that the experience was, to him personally, more convincing and more emotionally real than almost anything he'd encountered in his ordinary waking life, and that it permanently changed how seriously he took the question of what, if anything, continues after the body stops, a question he had, until then, treated mostly as an open theoretical curiosity rather than something he felt personally invested in resolving. He described the emotional texture of the vision as impossible to fully translate into ordinary language, no matter how carefully he tried, a limitation he acknowledged openly, rather than papering over with more confident phrasing than the experience actually warranted, choosing honest inadequacy over the false precision a more polished retelling might have offered instead. Modern content about near-death experiences often treats stories like this one as settled proof of an afterlife, packaging them with total certainty for an audience eager for reassurance, stripping out every hesitation and qualification the original account actually contained in favor of a cleaner, more marketable story, one that fits neatly into a short clip, rather than the fuller, more uncertain account Jung actually left behind. Jung's own account resists that kind of confident packaging. He described what happened to him in exact, careful detail, and then explicitly declined to claim more certainty than he actually had. That distinction matters, and it's worth sitting with rather than rushing past. A profound personal experience, described honestly, is not the same thing as evidence that would satisfy a skeptic. And Jung, a trained scientist as much as a mystic by temperament, understood that difference better than most people who cite his story today, precisely because he spent his entire long career navigating the tension between those two demands, scientific rigor and genuine personal experience, without ever fully resolving it either. Even without claiming certainty, Jung didn't dismiss the experience either, filing it away as a random side effect of illness never to be mentioned again, and that middle position is arguably the most useful part of the entire story. He treated it as genuinely significant data about his own psyche, worth recording carefully and thinking about seriously, without needing to resolve, once and for all, exactly what it ultimately meant or where it had truly come from, comfortable letting the question stay open for the rest of his life rather than forcing a premature answer. That's a difficult balance for most people to hold, and an even harder one to maintain under any kind of social pressure, whether that pressure comes from skeptical colleagues or from an audience hungry for a more dramatic conclusion. Taking an experience seriously without either explaining it away completely to sound appropriately rational, or overselling it into more certainty than it can honestly support to sound appropriately profound. Jung spent the rest of his life, another 17 years, doing exactly that with this particular memory, returning to it more than once in his later writing and letters, revisiting the same handful of images without ever flattening them into a simple, tidy conclusion in either direction, resisting the pull toward a neater story, even as his own reputation and audience grew. Jung came about as close to death as a person can come and still describe it years later in his own words, one of remarkably few thinkers of his particular stature, to leave behind such a detailed, deliberate account of the experience, rather than a brief, vague mention buried in a footnote. And what he ultimately brought back wasn't a clean, simple answer wrapped up neatly with a bow. It was a vivid, specific, carefully recorded experience that he respected too much to oversimplify in either direction, refusing both the comfortable dismissal and the comfortable certainty that would have made the story easier to tell. Not proof, and not nothing, sitting deliberately in the harder space between the two. That's worth remembering the next time you hear someone describe an intense personal experience, with either total dismissal or total certainty. Whether it's a near-death experience, a dream that felt more real than reality, or a coincidence that seemed to mean something. The honest position is often the harder one in the middle, taking something seriously without pretending it settles more than it actually does, and resisting the pressure to pick a tidy side just to end the conversation faster. If this kind of breakdown of real ideas from real thinkers is useful to you, subscribe and turn on notifications, because we're doing this every single week, one real thinker and one real story at a time. Tell us in the comments, has anything ever happened to you that you took seriously without ever being fully able to explain it, even to yourself?